Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. In this episode, I'm excited to have Matt Bush back, this time to talk about fuel. Now, if you're in our community or following along with any of our content, you know that I talk about fuel a lot. And that's because appropriately fueling your brain and your body is absolutely foundational and critical if you want any results to stick in the long term. In this episode, Matt and I discuss what it is to have a fuel capacity issue and how does it present in an individual. We also talk about some very specialized solutions for helping a person to overcome a fuel issue, whether that's through movement, specific breathing exercises, or even nutrition. This is a great episode. I think you're going to like it. Here we go. Matt Bush, the professor. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you for having me back. I'm honored to be here.
Yes, you are back. Very excited to have you back. And for our listeners, just so you guys know, this is Matt's second time back on the show. And the first time that we had a conversation, Matt talked all about the neurology of posture. And it was an awesome episode. I still get feedback on it. And it happened to be one of the most downloaded episodes. So it was in the top 3 most downloaded episodes for us for 2024. So I was excited to get Matt back. And I know that our community is excited to have you back, Matt, because I spoke with them before this and we teed up some questions and I kind of have an idea of where their minds are in terms of what they want to know about today's topic. And I'm fired up for it too, because I've got a lot of questions and I know there's going to be a lot to learn from you.
Let's rock and roll. I love it.
You know, before we get into the nerdy stuff, because last time when you were on, we dove right in. And today I was hoping we could take just like a couple minutes where you could just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you actually got into the world of neuro and brain-based training.
Yeah, for sure. So we have to dial the clock all the way back to 2004. So I've been in this neuro world for 20 years now, officially, which seems so crazy. Feels like yesterday. I was kind of always an athlete, multi-sport athlete in high school and then recreational in college. But in 2004, I was like 22 years old, playing beach volleyball, soccer, ultimate frisbee, like multiple times a week. But I was that guy who was always out in like double knee braces and double ankle braces, because after doing any of those sports, I would be in so much pain for the next 2 or 3 days. Like I thought that bracing was going to be the way to support and, save my joints, not get old. And so I remember, because I had blown out one knee, I torn the meniscus in the other, had that operated on, multiple ankle sprains. So there's a lot of history.
Right.
But in 2004 is when I met Kathy, who's now my wife. She actually introduced me to neurology in the first place. We happened to be at a mutual family vacation at Disneyland in California. My family knew her family. For whatever reason, we had all gotten together. And as we were walking around on the concrete at Disneyland, like my knees and ankles were just killing me. So much pain. And she's like, hey, let me teach you a couple of these mobility exercises. They might help. And we ended up doing what is effectively now known as opposing joints, right? Where if your knees hurt, you work on your elbows. If your ankles hurt, you work on your wrist.
Mm-hmm.
They knocked the pain down to like 0 after, Advil wasn't touching it. Stretching and trying to activate my muscles and joints wasn't working. But these drills helped. And I was like, okay, this is weird. And so the next time that she happened to be traveling to LA, where I was living at the time, I asked her if she would spend a day and teach me more of these exercises. So she taught me basically just joint proprioception, joint mobility from head to toe. We just went through the whole body. And I was like, okay, this is really cool, but what do I do with this? She goes, well, just practice the whole body every day. Just once a day, go through all of it, which if you slow down and work through that ends up being about 30 minutes to really take your time and go through it. So I started working on it, and I remember exactly 8 weeks later was like the light bulb moment for me. I had gone out to an ultimate frisbee game, and I opened up my bag to get out my knee braces and my ankle braces. And I look in the bag and they're not there. I had left them at home. And I was like, oh, it's that moment of making a decision, right?
Yeah.
Am I going to play without the braces, or am I going to just, hang my head in defeat and go home? And I'm like, hey, I've been doing these drills for 8 weeks. Like, let's see what happens. And so I decided to play. And that game, I swear up and down because I did not wear the bracing and I had been doing all the mobility work and the neuro stuff. That was the first game that I didn't have any pain afterward, didn't have any pain the next day. Like I felt like I was in my teenage years again where I was superhuman, like do anything.
Yeah.
And that's such a big transition because, at that point, talking about being in pain and wearing those braces, I had been to doctors, I'd been to physical therapy multiple times, and everybody's answer at the end of the day was, well, you're just starting to get old and it's just going to be this way. I mean, I was only 22.
Right.
So that's not fun to hear that.
Yeah.
So when I was able to go through that 90-minute game, like it's basically the length of a full soccer game, and play great, have no pain, wake up the next day and feel awesome. I was like, okay, there's something to this. Like, I need to know more.
Hmm.
And so I was in the middle of a master's degree at the time in California. So I finished my master's degree. It took a little time for me to circle back around, but I got back into the personal practice of neurology first, learning it for myself. And then in 2010, I made the transition into working with a neurology company. And then I started teaching in 2011. So teaching professionally since 2011 for trainers and therapists and athletes and whoever needs to know. So like that whole story really started with my own pain
Yeah.
and having to overcome that because I wasn't okay just always hurting. Like I was always seeking answers, but neurology was really the first thing that opened up that door that there was more possibility out there that wasn't just driven by injections or medications or surgeries and like the typical medical route.
Right.
So that's the big transformation is I don't have my braces. What am I gonna do?
Yeah. Yeah. I can totally relate to that because, post athletic career for me, same thing. Lots of pain, lots of chronic aching and all the traditional stuff not really doing much for me. And when I started learning that same group of exercises that you're talking about, that I began learning from you, because I started learning from you in probably about 2015 ish, everything changed. I mean, that, the joint mobilizations and the whole proprioceptive mapping idea is such low hanging fruit. And as soon as I started doing that, I just started feeling better
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
moving better. It's just really, really powerful stuff. And that's not even that's like just the tip of the iceberg with neuro.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right, man. So let's get into the goods. Today's topic is a really interesting one. I want to discuss fuel issues, Matt. And I know that, people in our immediate community they've heard me talk a lot about fuel. But there's always questions that come up. And just to kind of give some context to this, a lot of folks, when they are coming to us and trying our programs and getting involved in our courses, a lot of people find that they normally will tell you that they've tried lots of different things and those things haven't really helped them very much, or they can get temporary relief and then issues come back, and they have basically what we call the whack-a-mole pattern, where pain might be in
Yeah.
one area
Yeah.
of the body. They go and address it with, XYZ modalities and exercises. And then all of a sudden, maybe that pain is resolved, but a new pain crops up. There's just lots of different patterns that we kind of categorize as a possible fuel capacity issue. And then once we get people to that point where they have that aha moment, like, oh, yes, I am this person. This is my pattern. I understand now. A lot of questions come up about what is a fuel issue? and how is that affecting my brain and my nervous system, and why does that prevent me from getting some results to stick? So what I was kind of hoping you could do to start out, Matt, is if you could lay some foundational education down for us on fuel and why it's so important for the brain. And I was kind of hoping that that would just kind of lead us into some conversations about what a fuel capacity issue might be or how that might present. And
Yeah.
we'll just go from there.
Yeah, sure. So we talk about fuel as one of the two things that the brain needs to stay alive. Okay. And the other being activation, which I'm sure we'll touch on at some point
Right.
in this conversation. But the reason we use that language that it needs to stay alive is based on this concept, which is more of a law, a rule in neurology that all neurons in the brain and nervous system are always active. Sometimes when people first get into neurology or when we're using more colloquial language, we talk about a neuron being on or off or excited or inhibited, which is actually more technically correct language. But we get this picture of like a light switch where it's
Mm-hmm.
either working right now or it's just resting right now. And that's not really true. The thing about neurons is that they have to stay metabolically active in order to literally stay alive. And so they are always working, they're always doing something. So if we take that and translate it into like a metaphor of, it's like a car engine. The car engine would always have to be running because if you ever turn it off, let's imagine if you ever shut off the ignition of your car, it loses the ability to turn back on, right? Like it's dead. That's the end of that car, and now you have to go get a new car. You would, if
Mm-hmm.
that was the case, you would leave it running all the time, right?
Right.
Or you could say it's kind of like the electricity that's feeding into your home, whether it's your, single family home, apartment, condo, wherever you live, the electricity is always turned on to your home dwelling. And if it ever shuts off, like you're going to have some major problems,
Right.
right? Your refrigerator goes off, all the food spoils, you can't turn the lights on, possibly can't use the telephone or the internet. Like major things begin to shut down if you ever lose that ongoing source of energy. Okay. So when our neurons have to be active at all times in order to literally stay alive, it means that they're going to need fuel, right? Just like a car is going to need gasoline to run on, or maybe electricity these days, your home
Mm-hmm.
needs to be getting electricity from the power station. We could consider those as fuel sources for those different things. So, fuel is super important for the nervous system and the brain because if we ever run low on fuel metabolically, it means that neurological function is going to suffer. Okay, so the function is supported by the fuel. The fuel has to be there at all times so that the neurons are being fed and they can stay active.
Right.
And our body has multiple redundant systems to make this possible. Like we could take a left turn and get into a whole conversation about the metabolic systems of the body, right? But let's simplify it and say number one, our brain's favorite fuel to run on is glucose, followed by several other sugars like fructose and sucrose and anything that basically ends with an ose. It's a
Mm-hmm.
sugar molecule. And then the brain can also run on ketones if it needs to, right? From fat.
Mm-hmm.
So even when we're not ingesting sugar or glucose, we can still survive because we can break down triglycerides into glucose. So we create our own, which is so cool to me. That's one of my
Yeah.
favorite things about the human body is we can go into what's called the gluconeogenesis and build our own glucose molecules from fat. But we can also live on the ketones that are released whenever we break apart fat molecules. So we have this long-term source of fuel storage by way of fat on the human body that we can use when food is not readily available, right?
Right.
And then like number four in the redundancy pattern is that our liver stores glycogen, which can be then converted back into glucose if we need it. And so, like, it's so important. There's four different ways that our brain and body can receive fuel and store and then make it abundant again. And so, like when we start talking about fuel as like the foundational understanding, what we see, and I mean, I see this in myself, I'm sure you do, we see it in our clients all the time, is that when our fuel levels get low and our system either has to switch to one of those backup systems or possibly starts to run on adrenaline and cortisol a little bit,
Right.
then overall neural function suffers. We start to see more deficits in performance. We see more increases in pain and anxiety at that time. Less cognitive ability, becomes available for us.
Right.
And so everything gets a little bit harder. And then eventually, if that's not remedied, if it goes on for days or weeks at a time, then you start to get into more of a neurological dysfunction where it's not just a momentary deficit, but it's a system or an input or an integration that starts to suffer more on a long-term scale of time. And we
Mm.
begin to actually lose function. Okay, it doesn't just diminish, but we start to lose those functions over time because our whole brain, we talk about it as a use it or lose it type of system. So a type of a deconditioning sets in when fuel is a problem for a long period of time. So
That's
I think that's a pretty good start.
yes, yes, that's excellent. And let's hit on the activation piece too.
Yeah.
Right. So
So
yeah, what can you say about that?
activation is like imagine you're playing a game of telephone with all your friends and neighbors, right? And one person talks to the next person and sends a message to the next person and sends the next person. But think about like, let's say you have a neighbor who lives at the end of the street named Mary, and nobody connects their telephone to Mary's telephone, right? So Mary's just out there on an island. She's not getting any communication. She's not hearing from the neighbors. Like, eventually the relationships and the sense of community and involvement is going to suffer for Mary because she's no longer connected to the whole.
Mm.
And that's kind of a bit of a silly metaphor because in our brain and our neurons, it's not just they're going to feel lonely.
Right. Right.
But without activation, or I should say, without being activated, they begin to lose their ability to work and perform their function. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's like think of the brain like this big relay station where we're receiving sensory input from all of our sensory systems, whether that's somatosensation, joint proprioception, vision, vestibular, auditory, interoception from our organs and tissues, all these inputs, right? So if there's a particular brain region whose its job is to receive and process and integrate somatosensory inputs, our tactile sensation of touch, right? But it stops receiving input, it doesn't have anything to do. It's
Right.
like someone who works at the office, but all responsibilities have been removed from them. They're like, well, you got to show up to work, but there's nothing to do. Eventually, their ability to activate, their ability to work is lost because of deconditioning.
Hmm.
So all neurons have to be active at all times to not die, and they have to receive activation from other connecting neurons, and then they connect to other neurons themselves and feed them with activation. So it's this chain of ongoing activation that's always active, sometimes in higher doses, sometimes in lower doses. That's where the excitation and inhibition comes in, but they can't stop or else they begin to die.
That makes great sense. Okay, so in your experience, what how do fuel capacity issues kind of come into the work that you do? Like what are you experiencing when you're working with clients or athletes where your mind all of a sudden goes, "Oh, I think we need to start working on fuel with this individual." What are you seeing?
Yeah, there's a few big things that are more common, and then there's some other ones that maybe aren't as expected for people
Mhm.
when they first get into this work. The common ones are like someone's performance starts to degrade.
Mhm.
And I mean, we've all experienced this probably before in a training session or a sport or even in a cognitive task. Like we start off, we're feeling really good, we're strong or smart, and then, two-thirds of the way through, our performance starts to tank.
Right.
That's an easy one, often related to depletion of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Second big one is someone who, from the get-go, is like, man, I know I'm better than this. I should be performing better. I should be stronger. I should be able to connect the dots cognitively. I don't know why it's not working. That's a great place to test out some fuel supply.
Mm-hmm.
The third is simply like a lack of coordination. So when we get into some of the brain regions and neuroanatomy, a big area that uses a huge amount of fuel, has tons of neural activation, is the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
And when it starts to lose its fuel supply, poor coordination, poor accuracy, and poor balance start to show up.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I'm working on basic movement rehab with someone, no, we're not talking about playing a sport, but like clinical therapeutic rehab or corrective exercise, and I see their coordination start to slip, that becomes an indicator for me that we need to look at fuel.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth big one is emotional volatility. So this is a little bit of cerebellum, but a lot of prefrontal cortex in the frontal part of the brain,
Mm-hmm.
because the front part of the brain should be regulating our emotional systems and our kind of emotional reactivity, like keeping everything under wraps.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the frontal part of the brain is the last area of the brain to receive fuel. Okay, so it's like the last to be supplied, the first to run out, and yet it has one of the most important jobs of regulating our emotional feelings and reactions.
That's very interesting. So is this related to like the feeding pattern of how?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So the back bottom part of the brain gets blood supply first, which is where glucose and oxygen come from. The back bottom part of the brain also gets activation first because all sensory input goes into the back of the brain before it's moved up to the front of the brain. So the front of the brain is the last to get fuel and activation. And then when fuel levels start to drop, the frontal lobe is the area that depletes most quickly, right? So when we see emotional reactivity start to increase and a little bit more emotional volatility, like I'm more easily frustrated by something or annoyed, I have more trouble maybe keeping my mouth shut and not saying that thing that I was thinking,
Mm-hmm.
or just anger, frustration, all of that starts to bubble up to the surface. That's often a fuel issue as well, because the frontal lobe has lost its ability to regulate because it's low on fuel.
Yeah, and there goes some of our executive functions.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I when I'm talking to this with my clients and my students, I go, how many of you have ever felt that when you're hungry, you get a little more dumb? Like, you
Yeah.
don't make great decisions when you're hungry, right? And pretty much everybody raises their hand. Yeah, that's a fuel issue. If your frontal lobe doesn't have adequate fuel supply, you're not going to be as smart as you could be otherwise. So those are the big ones that show up. The ones that are a little more nuanced that we don't see as often are folks who have diminished frontal lobe activation all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In our world, we would call that like a presentation of a frontal lobe deficit. So often that person is kind of they have a flat affect on their face. There's not a lot of emotive expression happening. There is not a lot of shoulder movement when they're walking. It's kind of like the arms are pinned to their side. And in decision making, they're often pretty apathetic. Like, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter, whatever, I don't care. Because the frontal lobe isn't tracking and actually deciding. It's just kind of floating along, like, yeah, whatever's fine.
Right.
So I often associate that one with a fueling issue, which it also, I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little because it also presents as a dopamine deficiency. They're kind of very similar.
Mm.
But when we look at even the anatomy of this dopamine pathway, the termination of that dopamine process happens in the frontal lobe. It's the orbitofrontal part of the cortex
Mm.
that really helps us decide when is it a reward worth chasing. So if the frontal lobe is low on fuel, then yeah, that whole dopamine system is going to suffer at that time.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, what about pain presentations? Like the client who has chronic pain, In my experience, I've always felt like a lot of the folks that are struggling with whether it's an acute fuel issue or even chronic, they typically have that kind of floating pain syndrome.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah,
talk about just like pain presentations that may be related to fuel?
that's very true. The whack-a-mole transient pain that you described earlier
Yeah.
is kind of the biggest one that I think of as a fuel issue. And more than anything else, I describe that to my clients as your brain is going to perceive a lack of fuel as a threat. And so if there's a chronic fuel issue, then it doesn't want you going out there and giving 100% energy to anything that you do,
Right.
right? Because your brain is wired for survival and the conservation of energy. If it recognizes that there's not a lot of fuel happening right here, it's gonna be like, we should just take everything kind of easy. Like, don't push too hard, don't move too fast, don't do too much. And one of the ways that it can easily slow us down is by giving us physical pain.
Right.
It's like a road bump, it slows us down from going too fast. So the transient pain that migrates to different parts of the body, you work on one, it gets better, then it goes somewhere else. You work on that, it gets better, then it goes somewhere else. That transient migrating pain. I often think of a fuel issue for that.
Hmm.
And in chronic pain, because a lot of chronic pain is tied to metabolics, I don't run across very many chronic pain cases that do not have a fuel issue.
Right.
Most of the time, there's a correlation and a connection. It may not be the major contributor going on. There might be other stuff happening, but at the same time, there is often a fuel problem when someone has chronic pain.
That makes sense. So, one of the comments that I get back a lot when I start to bridge somebody into this concept of having the obstacle of a fuel capacity issue, because it is a very hard thing to educate someone on if they've never really heard anything like this before, because most people just kind of immediately go, well, I eat well, like my nutrition's good, I eat healthy, whatever that is for the person.
Yeah.
And so they kind of graze over this and they don't necessarily check this box the first time around because it's like, well, this conversation is not for me because I put effort into eating healthy. And I guess my question is, can you eat healthy? Obviously that's going to be different for different people, but can you eat healthy and still have a fuel capacity issue?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And there's two reasons why, if we keep it pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
One is eating healthy doesn't necessarily mean that you're providing enough fuel. And because there's so many definitions of healthy, right?
Sure.
Someone can go, yeah, I'm eating keto and that's really healthy. Well, you're really low on carbohydrates and glucose at that point,
Right.
right? And ketosis works for a little while, yeah. But at some point, most people who are on keto hit a wall and they hit a plateau. Their energy starts to crash, their metabolic start to crash because our body is not meant to live on ketones forever.
Right.
It's supposed to be a short-term survival mechanism. I mean, kind of like to get us through the dark, cold winter until, spring arrives and more food is available. It's not supposed to be a year-round eating strategy.
Right. Right.
Um, so like if you're low on carbohydrates, low on glucose or fructose intake, that can create issues. But the other side of it is even if you're eating perfectly, breathing is the other side of the fuel delivery mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
What's your oxygen utilization look like? Are you providing enough oxygen to the brain and nervous system? Or are you over breathing, which is an interesting thing that I want to get to in a few
Definitely.
minutes. Are you over breathing? And even though there's a ton of oxygen, your body literally can't use all of it. And so your cells are going through starvation, not getting enough oxygen at that point. So breathing is another huge side of this that doesn't have anything to do with how I eat or what's my nutrition. But if I have poor breathing habits, fuel is automatically a problem.
Right. And it's fairly common to have poor breathing habits for so many different ways.
Very
Reasons,
common,
excuse me.
actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
very common. So let's start talking about kind of how we might start to change our thinking in terms of how we would approach a possible fuel issue. Where does your mind go as an instructor and coach when you're about to guide your students into starting to improve their fuel capacity so that they can have a better experience with the other drills that you're going to teach them and reducing pain and improving their performance?
Yeah. So my brain typically starts with assessment. Like I need to figure out through an assessment process, do we have more of a nutritional and a glucose issue, or do we have an oxygen issue? I want
I
to know
see.
which path we need to follow first. And they might need both. That's certainly possible. But usually one is more of an acute need. So what I do there is let's say I'm in a training session with someone that could be in person or over Zoom. I might take them through a few breathing assessments and exercises to find out if providing better oxygen levels or oxygen utilization is going to help the fuel issue that we're seeing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That one's easy to test. I don't need to have them leave and go get a snack or a drink or anything. I can just dive right into the exercises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So typically, what I'll have them do for that is either an exercise called air hunger, where basically they will take one or two normal breaths, and then on the final one, after the exhale, they hold their breath. So it's a breath hold post exhale, and they'll just walk around in the room that they're in, essentially until they feel the strong urge to breathe. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't take very long, right?
Right. Right.
Like most of the time, it's about 10 seconds before they're like, oh, gotta stop, gotta take a breath. But what happens when we do air hunger is we are allowing carbon dioxide to build up in their tissues during that time period. And then when they start breathing again, they're going to have that heightened level of carbon dioxide is going to help their brain, nervous system, and in fact, all the cells of their body make a fast transition to basically gulp or absorb a huge amount of oxygen really quickly. And so, what it allows us to see, kind of as the coach, is if I provide good oxygen availability, does their nervous system take that in and then create a functional change? Like, do they reassess better?
Yeah. This is a really interesting topic. I mean, this basically is under the umbrella of like CO2 tolerance training. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I use air hunger exercises like Matt is describing quite a bit. And in fact, we even program them like into our warm-ups just
Yeah.
because it can be such a nice thing to do before you start to do other forms of training that require a great deal of accuracy and coordination. And it's actually really wild, and I'm sure you can speak on this as well, but it is really wild to assess somebody's, let's say, do a grouping of cerebellar tests, and you find a deficit, which for our listeners, when you see somebody that has a cerebellar deficit, what you're kind of seeing in those assessments is a difficulty with coordination and rhythm, and movements become ratchety. It's just a breakdown of the coordination. It's amazing how after a few bouts of air hunger exercise, you can see that stuff immediately fix. It's really, really neat.
Yeah. And like what you're describing is basically that is none of the normal observations that we talked about earlier of like what does it look like when someone has a fuel issue. We're right now we're just talking about using it as well, they had a breakdown in their movement, right? They had a motor control problem. Let's try air hunger. And it can sometimes immediately solve that. So, which is coming from the world of like biomechanical training and more traditional training is kind of mind blowing.
It is.
Because usually if someone has a movement coordination problem, you're like, I got to train the movement, right?
Right.
There's either a muscular coordination issue or maybe peripheral nerves aren't innervating well. Like we go searching through looking for like what's the problem. And when you start biomechanically looking at the tissues, you're generally not going to find an immediate problem.
Right.
It's like, well, everything kind of seems like it's okay. Maybe they're just not coordinated. But when you know this information, you kind of have this little peek into neuro world. It's like if you give them 1 or 2 rounds of air hunger, provide better oxygen to the cerebellum, all the coordination kind of takes care of itself.
It does, and I think that's a great example of why some people are telling you and I when they start to work with us that nothing has worked in the past, or no matter how much they train a certain skill or whatever, things aren't really changing. Because if you're still following that biomechanical model only, whatever you try to do locally to improve the coordination or the strength, you don't realize that you're eating up the limited fuel that you have.
Right.
And therefore, your brain is kind of making a calculation ahead of time going, all right, we don't have the fuel support to meet the demand of this training. So it's not in our best interest to drive any kind of plastic change in the long term.
Absolutely. Even I'm going to maybe step on a couple toes here, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's important for the
Yeah, go
listener.
ahead.
Even in the people who have done some neurology work, when I kind of have surveyed the neurology education and training industry over the last couple of years, I would say 85% of the neuro programs out there are still really just focused on somatosensation and proprioception.
Mm-hmm.
And this includes stuff like reflexes, like primitive reflex rewiring, um, peripheral receptor training, nerve techniques, PNF stuff, which is a lot older, but proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Um, all of these like really cool systems, like they're actually really fancy and really awesome, but they're like just super advanced proprioception. Like I'm
Right.
doing neurology, but I'm working on nerves and receptors. Even when you do that and you're like, I'm going to facilitate this thing or turn off this other one and that's getting in the way, I need to inhibit that, you need to activate or deactivate this reflex. Those are all really valuable tools, but they're not going to fix the fuel issue that the brain is having,
Right.
right? So like this look at taking zooming out, like extract ourselves from being so myopically focused on the site of that miscoordination. Zoom out and go, what brain area do I need to focus on? What might it need? Fuel often becomes the thing that appears lacking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, okay, great. So, CO2 tolerance training could
Yeah.
start with air hunger, right? There's
Yep.
a large there's lots of different exercises that I think could fall into the CO2 category. We could do an
Should
entire
we define
episode on
that
it.
real quick?
Yeah, yeah. Can we do that? And yeah, in fact, can you talk about what is your CO2 tolerance?
Yeah, sure. So let's take a tiny step back from there and go, everyone knows oxygen is the fuel that our cells and neurons need. We tend to think of CO2, which is carbon dioxide, as a byproduct or a waste product, that it's produced when we go through the aerobic energy process and generate ATP. Carbon dioxide and water are the byproducts, and then we need to get rid of those by exhaling and breathing out the CO2. What most people don't recognize is that carbon dioxide actually functions within that process as a vehicle to allow the oxygen to get into the cell where it needs to be utilized.
Mm,
So without adequate levels of carbon dioxide, we can't use the oxygen that's floating around in our bloodstream. Okay. And that's based on like organic chemistry, where when an oxygen molecule binds to hemoglobin inside of a red blood cell, if you ever took chemistry before, whether that was high school or university, once molecules bind together, they don't get to unbind at will. Like they can't just go, okay, see you later, bye bye, boop, and
Mm.
disconnect. The only way that a molecule gets to unbind is if something else comes along and binds to that grouping and basically kicks it off, right? Like
Oh.
through a chemical reaction. So carbon dioxide being taken up into the red blood cell then kicks off the oxygen so that it can get into the cell or the neuron where it needs to be used for fuel. Okay. So what happens is that we have these chemoreceptors in our brainstem and in the aorta. And a chemoreceptor is basically a nerve receptor that's measuring chemical levels of whatever's going on. So these ones are measuring the overall pH level of our blood, or we could say the acidity of our bloodstream. Carbon dioxide happens to be an acid. Okay. So what these chemoreceptors are monitoring is how much carbon dioxide or how much acid do I have in my bloodstream. And when my pH drops and becomes too acidic, these chemoreceptors are what trigger my nervous system and therefore my muscles and my lungs that it's time to take another breath and bring in more oxygen. So, to say that another way, the breathing, our respiratory rate and breathing pattern modulates the pH level of our bloodstream to keep it in a normal range by measuring the amount of CO2 that we're carrying. Okay. What's tricky and where we get into CO2 tolerance is that those chemoreceptors are trainable. So I'm going to give some numbers here. These are just arbitrary numbers so that we understand the concept. So let's say that when I take in a breath, an inhale, I get 100 units of oxygen, and currently floating around in my bloodstream is like 25 units of CO2. Over the next 2, 3, 5 seconds, those numbers are going to shift. The oxygen is going to decrease as oxygen leaves my bloodstream and goes into different cellular locations, while CO2 is going to increase. So let's say that during the period between the breath, while I'm moving, my oxygen depletes from 100 units down to 25. My CO2 level goes from 25 up to 50. Okay. They're not exactly reciprocal of one another. That's why the numbers are different. When my CO2 level gets up to 50, these chemoreceptors go up, time to breathe. I need to get rid of some of the CO2, bring in more oxygen. So I take an inhale and it restores the original numbers. I'm back to 100 units of oxygen. CO2 is down to 25 units again. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the trainability of these chemoreceptors, what I mean by that is normally they might be triggering this at 50 units of CO2, but when they become trained or conditioned and intolerant of more CO2, they might go, we used to wait until 50 to breathe, but now that's not very comfortable. I'm going to breathe when there's only 40 units of CO2. Right? So by lowering the threshold, it increases the respiratory rate. So we're bringing in oxygen more frequently because I'm not letting the CO2 level get all the way up to 50. I'm
Right.
only letting it get up to 40. So I breathe sooner and I bring in more oxygen. And then that makes even 40 units of CO2 feel uncomfortable. So now I'm going to breathe when I only get up to 30. So now the breathing happens even faster. I'm bringing in more oxygen, allowing less CO2 to build up. And now that CO2 range is only going from 25 to 30 to 25 to 30 to 25 to 30, which means I'm breathing in more oxygen very rapidly. I'm oversaturating my bloodstream with oxygen, and there's not enough CO2 present in the bloodstream to do that binding inside of the hemoglobin, kick off the oxygen molecules, and allow them to get into my cells and neurons where they need to be used.
Mm.
So while I have a huge amount of oxygen floating around in my bloodstream, my cells and neurons are going through what we might call cellular asphyxiation, where they can't get enough oxygen to do their job, to function and stay healthy. So
Really, it sounds like suffocation,
they are suffocating at a cellular level because they can't get the oxygen out of the bloodstream and into their cellular matrix.
which is so counterintuitive if you don't know this science.
Exactly. So
because
what we
most
have
people
to do
think
to,
you just need the oxygen
yeah, what we have,
purely.
and this is actually why if you ever, like if you're watching a space movie like about astronauts and the space shuttle or like sci-fi stuff, they talk about sometimes like an oxygen leak would kill all the astronauts in the space station. Because if you're ever in a fully 100, like 100% oxygenated environment and there's not CO2, you're literally going to suffocate.
Wow.
Okay. So you can't survive in a full oxygen environment. You have to have the CO2. So when we talk about CO2 tolerance and improving CO2 tolerance, what we mean is we want to retrain those chemoreceptors in that nervous system to be more comfortable with higher levels of CO2. We don't want it to trigger a new breath every time it gets to that 30 units. We want it to be able to go up to 40 and all the way up to 50 before it triggers another breath, because that ensures that we have enough CO2 in the system to create the gas exchange at a cellular level and make sure all of our tissues and our brain and nervous system actually get the oxygen that they need. Okay.
That's very interesting. So, in essence, when we start to train our CO2 tolerance and we're doing, let's say, air hunger exercises or whatever form of breathing drill, is going to do it, it's in essence like a hyper perfusion type of technique. We're
Yeah,
basically, the goal is to push blood to our tissues and our brain.
exactly. Yep, exactly. So we can do air hunger. Bag breathing is another favorite to
Right.
improve CO2 tolerance. And the third one I really like is called straw breathing.
Oh, yeah. Straw breathing.
And straw breathing is great. I mean, for those who don't know, you hold a drinking straw in your lips, okay? Breathe in through your nose for 2 seconds, out through the straw for 8 seconds. So the first thing this does is slows down the breathing cycle. Each breath is a total of 10 seconds in and out, which is probably 3 times slower than normal breathing rate. So we really slow it down. That gives time for CO2 to increase. So we're training CO2 tolerance just by doing that rhythm. But the other thing straw breathing encourages is good mechanical activation of the diaphragm and really good neurological control, because you have to figure out how hard do I have to breathe out through that straw to make my breath last for a full 8 seconds.
Hmm.
If I blow too hard, I'm going to finish after only 4 seconds. If I don't blow hard enough, it's going to take 12. So dialing in the force that we need to use is a really good breath training tool. So you get mechanical training, control training, and CO2 training all at the same time with something like straw breathing.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, one of the things that I do very, very routinely, really in the winter time, is I hop on our stationary bike here at home, and I don't pedal intensely. I let my intensity. I guess I should say I find my intensity based on whether or not I can maintain nasal breathing.
Yeah.
And I also at the same time do some blood flow restriction on my legs. And so I've got the cuffs on both legs, and it burns so good kind of thing. Muscles they have that kind of pump and fatigue feeling, and at the same time I'm trying to reduce my breathing a little bit, and I'm doing this through my nose, and it's hard. I have that sensation of air hunger as I'm doing it, but I do this for 10 to 15 minutes very routinely in the winter to literally prevent like seasonal depression. Like this
Yeah.
is this is what I do, and it's
Yeah.
so effective. It's amazing. Like if I feel my mood suffering or my energy suffering, even if I choose not to work out that day because I don't really feel like I'm at full capacity or I'm tired, I'll force myself to get on that bike with the BFR and the reduced breathing for the air hunger. Night and day difference. I
Well,
mean, unbelievable.
that is a full body workout.
It's a full body workout. Yes. It's funny because it feels like you're doing so much, but
Yeah.
the intensity is actually quite low. And then the next day when I wake up, no soreness, feel good. It feels like I did something that was more recovery based, that was less like energy output.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
just I even will solve pain with it.
Yeah.
If I've got some aches or pains from jujitsu or something, it's like, I'm hop on the bike and do this. I
Yeah.
love
I
it.
mean,
It's really useful.
BFR is such a great tool for increasing oxygen delivery to tissues, and getting kind of a jump start to metabolism.
Mm,
I mean, yeah, dealing with pain is really well done there. I mean, it also kind of sucks. Like you
yes,
kind of glossed over. It's hard.
it's hard.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's hard. And
yeah,
like
yeah. There's a training
doing the
effect.
doing the thing that sucks is going to boost your dopamine response. So that totally makes sense how that would help in the winter time for all of those things you mentioned.
Now, on the topic of CO2 tolerance training, how would you respond to somebody that said they really wanted to improve their CO2 tolerance, but they struggled with feelings of anxiousness because every time those receptors trigger them to breathe, they get basically panicky with that sensation. How do you
Oh
guide
yeah.
somebody to like find that training effect without making it a terrible experience because they're getting anxious?
Yeah. I mean, that was me when I first started. The first
Mm,
time I did straw breathing, the coach I was working with is like, here, yeah, put it in your mouth, 2 seconds in, 8 seconds out. Well, I only did like two breaths before I absolutely panicked. I was like, get this straw out of my mouth. I just need to breathe. Like I flipped out. Um, so I can relate. My response and kind of recommendation is modify the timing on straw breathing if that's the tool you're going to use.
hmm
Maybe it's the 1 to 2 seconds in and only 5 seconds out. So change the ratios. Instead of using a bag for bag breathing, maybe just place your hands over your nose and mouth and kind of breathe through your hands like you're
hmm
pretending to be Darth Vader.
hmm
If it's air hunger, only do 5 seconds of that breath hold. Don't push it all the way until you feel the deep air hunger. Just do a baby step. Okay. And I've worked with a lot of people that have that experience of anxiety and panic.
Yeah,
And the way to overcome it is just to start more slowly, dial it back, and start with a baby step that feels a little easier, and then you build on your success.
that's great. So there are different styles of breathing drills. Not
Right.
all breathing drills are going to fall into this category of good drills for building CO2 tolerance. I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit. I know it's deep, but if we could talk about it a little bit, and then I was hoping you could give us an idea of if we have several categories of breathing drills, some that are good for CO2 tolerance, some that might not be, which ones do we choose and why? Right? Like, how do
Yeah.
we know we're practicing in the right category if we want to improve our fuel capacity with breathing work?
Okay. So great question. The simple answer is, as a very general rule, breathing exercises that focus more on the exhale are going to be a better choice than breathing exercises that focus on the inhale. Okay. So think about anything that causes you to extend your exhale or increase the force of your exhale. Like you can use a breathing resistance device that you hold in your mouth,
Mm-hmm.
have to push against resistance. You can do straw breathing. You can do just what we call long exhale breathing. Um, Even something like a triangle breathing drill, but where the exhale is extended. So maybe you inhale for 4, exhale for 8 to 12, and then hold for 4. That's great, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the breath hold comes after the exhale, not after the inhale. The exhale is much longer than the inhale. So the
Mm-hmm.
general rule is make your exhales at least double the length of your inhales, and you're automatically going to be working on CO2 tolerance.
That's great.
Okay? If you flip that over and you do inhale focused breathing practice, now you're focusing on muscles of what are called muscles of inspiration, the muscles that do the inhale. You're focusing more on oxygen uptake, but not necessarily on oxygen utilization. That's the real difference. We want to put ourselves in a situation where we are encouraging better oxygen utilization, better efficiency, not focusing just on taking in more air.
That's a really good point. Which taking in more air, as I'm sort of thinking this through, listening to you, is technically what it is to be a chronic overbreather.
Yeah,
Like when
well,
you're in this
chronic
like
hyperventilation.
hyperventilation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep. And that, I mean, just as a side note on that one, there's a questionnaire that you know about this, but your
Right.
listeners might find this interesting. It's called the Nijmegen questionnaire. And it's an odd spelling. It's Nijmegen. And maybe we can put that in the show
I
notes.
can't believe you remembered that that spelling because
So
I can see
this,
it in my mind, but I can't spell it.
yeah, this was created by Dr. Nijmegen, gets to name it after himself, obviously. It's a series of 16 questions or symptoms that someone would take this questionnaire and they would rate themselves on the frequency that they experience these symptoms from 0 to 4. 0 is never, 4 is very frequently, and then the other numbers are somewhere in between. But it's things like anxiety, panic, tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, tingling in hands and feet, numbness, tingling or blue lips, increased heart rate, heart palpitations, difficulty with brain fog or cognitive tasking, and there's a few others. So 16 symptoms. And the way this all works out is if there's a possible score of 4 for each one of them, 16 times 4 would be a possible 64 points on the questionnaire, but someone only has to indicate 23 points, which is barely a third, to qualify as presenting with chronic hyperventilation.
Hmm.
Okay, so the way I talk about this, I go, look, if you were having some of these symptoms, like tightness in your chest, difficulty breathing, anxiety, tingling hands and feet, and you went to a general practitioner or your regular medical doctor, and you say all that stuff, there's a high likelihood they're going to refer you to a psychiatrist
I was gonna
because
say, get ready to go down a rabbit hole.
they're thinking you might have anxiety.
Yeah.
You go to the psychiatrist, you tell them the same symptoms. Psychiatry diagnosis based on symptom presentation. There's no medical testing. So they go, oh, you have the symptoms? Yep, we're going to diagnose you with anxiety, and then we're going to medicate you for that anxiety. Dr. Nijmegen is basically opening up this door as a possibility to go, maybe, at least it's in the realm of possibility that you don't just have anxiety, but you actually have a breathing problem.
Right.
And so when I present this to my clients, I go, just take the questionnaire, let's see how it goes, because there's at least a possibility that what you have going on is not psychosomatic, it's not anxiety, but there's a breathing dysfunction that if we can correct that, all these other symptoms might be reduced or go away entirely.
That's interesting. Are there any other things that come to mind, like uh, presentations that maybe aren't on the questionnaire that you would also say, like, this is a possible indicator of hyperventilation? I was thinking of like something along the lines of maybe being a mouth breather at night,
Yep.
that kind of a thing. Is there anything else that you can think of?
Mouth breathing is a big one. Regular or recurring headaches and migraines
Hmm.
is a big one.
I was just thinking
Um,
about the just now. I'm thinking just having like an upper chest breathing pattern.
yep.
That kind of that
Core
might fall in
diaphragm
that.
activation, certainly.
Yeah, yeah.
And also just having a rapid breathing pattern.
Hmm.
So if I'm working with a client, let's say it's our first session, we're sitting down and kind of talking through their history. During that conversation, I'm also paying attention to their breathing and I'm kind of watching how fast are they breathing. What I want to see is probably like 8 to 10 breaths per minute. So that's going to put us in the realm of, 6 to 7 seconds per breath.
Mm,
But if I see 15 to 20 breaths per minute, that means each breath is only 3 to 4 seconds in length. That's pretty fast.
right.
So I count their breaths over a 1 minute period of time to see how fast is it. And then I can kind of calculate, if it's 15 to 20, that's a little high. If it's 8 to 12, that's looking a little better. So yeah, rapid breathing is also an indicator here.
Interesting. So as far as these different styles of breathing drills,
Yep,
is it possible to practice the wrong type of breathing drill and essentially do exactly the opposite of what we're saying could be useful?
absolutely. Yep.
Okay, what kind of drill does that what kind of breathing drill does that look like?
If you start with inhale focused breath training, like trying to inhale greater volume, trying to inhale longer, trying to inhale more forcefully, that can create the issue of CO2 intolerance. And the second category is breathing drills that focus on over oxygenation of the tissues can also create it. And the
Mhm.
big one in that category is Wim Hof breathing.
Right.
Now, there's a time and a place for Wim Hof breathing. It's physiologically really cool what happens, but it's not where I would start someone on breath training because typically what you're doing in that series where you're taking 30 to 40 breaths and giant inhales is you're over oxygenating your tissues first. Then you're engaging in a really long breath hold. And so
Right.
during that long breath hold, yes, now we're flipping the scale on oxygen and CO2, and we're allowing more CO2 to build up. But we've only done that after the over oxygenation has happened first. So we're kind of training our nervous system to go, yeah, it's okay to increase your CO2 tolerance if you've done this major breathing of oxygen first. But what it lacks, in my opinion, is it doesn't train an ongoing level of CO2 tolerance for activities of daily living and normal training routines.
Right. Yeah,
It's
that's
kind of
interesting.
specialized.
Yeah, I think, people are attracted to intense things, right?
Yeah, for
They're more
sure.
likely to try that before they try gently breathing into a bag. But
Yeah,
that's just how
yeah.
people are.
So I would start with exhale focused breathing drills first, like we talked about a moment ago, starting
Hmm.
with, and the three we've talked about really are my favorite. Straw breathing, bag breathing, and air hunger are the place to start. Once those become a little bit more comfortable, then you can kind of reverse engineer and start working on the inhales to balance everything out.
I still have that old device where, you breathe into the straw and it blows bubbles in the water.
Yeah,
And I always really like that. There's something really relaxing about it for me. It's a little bit of
yeah,
resistance because you're blowing bubbles. And I just like the feedback of the water. If you blow too
yeah.
hard, it spills. You got to be just right. I like that thing, but you can't get those anymore.
Yeah, as far as I know, there was some disagreement over the marketing and licensing of those.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but I often, when I'm working with kids, I'll often grab just a glass of water and put a straw
yep,
in it, and I'll have them blow bubbles in the water.
yeah. That's great.
So, yeah,
All right, so let's see. As I'm kind of looking through my notes here, a few things I was hoping we could circle back to. Um, Often when we talk about fuel issues within our community and we start to talk about some of the nuances, a lot of folks that then begin to ask more questions are people that talk about struggling with hypermobility, autoimmune disorders, and then menopause comes up a lot. Is there anything you can talk about? One of the questions I got recently was, okay, if autoimmune conditions often come with some kind of fuel capacity issue, which came first, right? Is does anything come to mind that you would want to discuss with that?
yeah. So it's a really interesting conversation, and to kind of preface what I'm going to say, most of my education and therefore most of my beliefs on this topic come from this kind of part of the scientific world called the pro-metabolic camp. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Pro-metabolic researchers, pro-metabolic science. And so the perspective is that most autoimmune diseases are essentially metabolic diseases at their root.
Hmm.
That the tissues themselves have lost metabolic flexibility, and so they've begun to actually break down. like physical breakdown of tissues, which is then triggering an inflammatory response. Or in some cases, there's been a breakdown of thyroid function or hormone function, which has then triggered the immune system to think that there are, you know, pathogens, invaders, bad guys that it needs to attack. And so the immune system ends up attacking the body's own tissue in an autoimmune condition.
Right.
Most of those are predicated by metabolic dysfunction of some kind. So, as far as which comes first, I think that leans to the side of metabolic issues coming first and then becoming autoimmune conditions later.
Very interesting.
It does make it a little bit more challenging because while the simple, easy answer would be, oh, let's just fix the metabolism, that's really a challenge once the immune system is ramped up and you're in this inflammatory cycle. So it does come back to metabolics. We work with folks with autoimmune conditions and kind of work them through that process. Often you have to look at nutrition, at supplementations, at thyroid, at the hypothalamus and how the adrenal axis is working, and at inflammation cycles and how to lower the body's inflammatory responses. So it's like five things that are all tied together,
Right.
super multifactorial to get all of those kind of back on the same page and working as they're supposed to.
Hmm.
But at the root of it, when you simplify it, I often, well, in fact, I almost always find that metabolics is at the root.
And
And
now, is fuel and activation still a delivery system for these people to improve and get better?
100%, yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I'm glad you brought that up because as far as short-term improvements, that's where we focus, right? We go, look, when you're having a flare-up, when you're having pain, when you're having chronic fatigue, whatever the presentation is, the first thing we want you to reach for is fuel and then nervous system regulation tools.
Nice.
So that's where they start. And then we get into the conversations about what are the nutritional and lifestyle changes we need to make? How do we want to support your thyroid? How do we need to lower the inflammatory response? Like, and that all becomes part of it. But fuel and activation is usually where we start. Like session number one is,
Yep.
yeah, we
Nice.
need to teach you the tools and techniques and strategies that are going to give you some acute fuel availability and activation so that your nervous system can lower its perception of threat.
Nice. Nice. Well, let's so the last thing here on my list that I wanted to actually sort of circle back to, because you started talking a little bit about, glucose at the beginning of our conversation. I want
Yeah.
to circle back to this very bad and scary word called sugar, because when we get into these conversations with people and we're trying to educate them on, fuel and activation and the importance of glucose and sugars as the brain's preferred fuel source, a lot of people gasp when you say sugar, just because
Yep.
of, you know, how we have been educated around sugar. It's demonized. It's going to hurt you. It's bad. You couldn't possibly need it or want it, and you shouldn't. And it's very confusing for people to hear that the brain's preferred fuel source is coming from sugars. So I was hoping you could talk about that. Is it all bad? How can we harness it to our advantage? When do we need it, and what's appropriate versus what's not?
Yeah. So excellent topic. I think we could do an entire
Another
podcast.
podcast.
So we'll keep this short. And
Yes,
obviously, that means that some of this commentary is going to be a little simplified.
for sure.
So for listeners out there who do have more education in this space, just realize we're glossing over some details. So yeah, all sugar is not bad. Let's start there.
Hmm.
It has certainly been demonized in culture. If you actually go back to some of the early studies on sugar versus fat and some of the nutritional stuff that was done, and this could go all the way back to the 50s and 60s in the United States. Um, the research, first of all, there was some, it has now come to light. There's some underhanded dealings of blaming sugar or blaming fat or whatnot. And in the early days, the thought was fat makes you fat. right?
Right.
Ingesting fat makes you fat. So you got all the fat-free movement that came out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then it was saturated fat makes you fat. So you get margarine and seed oils and industrial oils and those kind of stuff. Come to find out, a lot of the researchers were paid off to say that fat was the problem rather than sugar being the problem.
Hmm.
So for a long time, fat was demonized, sugar was okay. Well, I think what we're experiencing now is kind of the pendulum swing over to the other side, where when people go, oh, it is sugar that makes you fat, now they demonize sugar in all kinds of ways. So we're living in this pendulum swing at the moment. The reason I say not all sugar is bad is because your brain needs it. Like it is not a great idea to do neurological rehab or training when you're trying to be in ketosis because
Right.
there's just not enough fuel to go around. Something is going to be sacrificed, something is going to suffer when you have that lack of fuel. So neurological rehab gets more challenging, neuroplasticity becomes more difficult when there isn't adequate fuel. Even, and I make this comparison in our courses, I go, look, when you're in an aerobic energy cycle and you're creating ATP through what's called the Krebs cycle, one cycle through that process is going to create 33 ATP molecules. When you go through a cycle of gluconeogenesis and you're turning triglycerides into glucose for your body to utilize, one cycle is only going to create 3 ATP. So you can have 33 units of fuel for your brain, or you can have 3 units of fuel for your brain. One of these seems a little bit more efficient than the other, right? So I don't want my clients and my students to be in gluconeogenesis or in ketosis all the time because they're clearly going to be lacking fuel that their brain could use. Um, However, so all of that being said, I think what is important is to recognize when we talk about like what are the best types of sugar we can go for, it's going to be sugars that come from whole foods. Okay. So processed white sugar, yeah, is bad for you. Like just granulated white sugar, it's been processed. All the other healthy parts of the food have been pulled out of it. It's been bleached, like chemically treated. Not great. Okay.
Hmm.
So I'm not a big proponent of just, refined white sugar, but when you start looking at carbohydrates that are in our diet, like root vegetables, sweet potatoes, squashes, um, natural whole grains that are going to provide glucose from the carbohydrate content that's in them. Plus, in all of those foods, you're also getting other vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that we need. You're getting real fiber that's going to offset some of the blood sugar issues that happen with refined sugars. Um, so whole food carbohydrates is more the way to go.
That's great.
I don't, and occasionally with clients, I'll go, yeah, based on your individual needs, you might need to have a couple of pieces of candy in your bag so that when you get a blood sugar crash or when you really run out of fuel, you're going to eat a little bit of candy. One of my
Yeah.
clients, actually, just a very quick story. He's a power lifter,
Hmm.
training for national championships that are coming up next year. Figured out that he was having a fuel crash in the middle of his training session.
Mm.
And through some trial and error testing, we figured out that the right fuel need for him was to give him 15 gummy bears in the middle of his training session.
Nice. Yeah.
Like they're made with glucose, glucose and gelatin, basically. And like that's all he needs though. He doesn't need a giant milkshake. He doesn't need a slice of cake,
Right.
Because the other thing that happens with sugar is often it's paired in these sweets with unhealthy grains, unhealthy oils, unhealthy additives,
Yeah.
you know. And I should have said this a few minutes ago. I'm going to go back to it real quick. Even throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, as sugar was studied more extensively, in the research, they often did not differentiate the source of the sugar. So they might have done a study on sugary breakfast cereals, and then at the end of it, they go, well, sugar's bad because, kids who ate this or adults who ate this had unhealthy biomarkers after the testing. Okay, great. What else was in the breakfast cereal? What kind of grain was it made with? Did it include glyphosate? What seed oils and industrial oils were included? What kind of gums preservatives were also in that breakfast cereal? What kind of dyes were in that breakfast cereal, right? So they did not differentiate the sugar from all the other unhealthy ingredients. They just tested the cereal and then came to the conclusion that the sugar was bad.
Interesting.
The reason that's important is we want to go, okay, yes, refined sugar is not healthy. It creates inflammation in the body. Refined sugar in all of these mass-produced sweets and junk food is not great because of all the other added ingredients. But whole food, like natural and healthy carbohydrate in our nutrition is advisable.
That's interesting. Thinking about
That is recommended.
yeah, I was thinking about the story you shared with the power lifter, being an athlete, needing the gummy bears. That makes sense. And what I'm wondering is if you were working with a client that was struggling with more of a chronic fuel issue, maybe they had chronic pain, maybe they were dealing with an autoimmune illness, something along those lines. Do you think there's an instance where some individuals have to think about increasing their sugar in some ways to support the demand of the training?
Almost always.
Almost always. I had a
Yep.
feeling you were going to say that because I mean, I feel like today too, just working with anybody, we sort of live in a time now where if you are health conscious and you are trying your best, you actually might be under eating sugar by accident just because you're reacting to what you're constantly being bombarded with in the media and through education, whether it's true or not. People
Yeah.
might be doing
I,
that, not know it.
I see that all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So often what I'll start those people with is what we have termed an adrenal cocktail,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
a mix of coconut water and orange juice. The ratio is up to you, your preference, but the reason for those two liquids is they're 50% glucose and then 50% either fructose or 50% sucrose.
So that's
And sucrose,
essentially
yeah,
what I just finished right here.
yeah. Sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose, for those who don't know that term. So you're getting a healthy amount of straight glucose plus some fructose going on at the same time. But the other benefit of coconut water and orange juice is they have really high levels of potassium,
Hmm.
which helps to stabilize blood sugar. So with those two particular juices, I'll call them that, you don't get the massive blood sugar spike and then crash that you would with some other fruit juices or with straight sugar. So it helps you stabilize. And then if you add a little bit of salt to it, you're providing some electrolytes and some sodium at the same time. So coconut water, orange juice, and salt makes this really nice, we call it that adrenal cocktail because it supports your adrenals. It supports your thyroid. It supports your metabolism. And I'll have someone like someone with an autoimmune illness or a thyroid issue. I'll have them add one or two of those per day simply for the purpose of increasing their glucose intake and giving them more metabolic resources. Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. Excellent. Well, listen, I'm glancing at the time. I want to be respectful of your time because I know that you're also with family right now on a little trip. So thank you so much for for taking the time to do this. Could we wrap up just by you talking a little bit about what you have going on, and if our listeners want to follow you and learn from you, how can they do that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about this year. We're recording this right at the beginning of 2025. So over at Next Level Neuro, we have just launched a new intro into applied neurology that I'm super excited about. So people can find us on Instagram at Next Level Neuro. That's our handle. Or our website is just nextlevelneuro.com. But I'm really excited about this fundamentals program that we've just put out. It's kind of an intro to applied neurology education and training. It's basically a self-paced program it's 8 sessions, but it's about 12 hours of teaching to introduce you to all the different sensory systems, how they can be assessed, how they can be trained, and then how they are all integrated together. So it gives you insight into stuff even similar to what we talked about today. There's a session on respiration and breathing where we talk about a lot of these concepts that we talked about today. But we'll get a link into the show notes. But for those who want to check it out, it's nextlevelneuro.com/fundamentals is the URL. But we would love for you to check that out. And if you contact us on IG or on the website, let us know you came from the Cruise Elite podcast. We've also got a little free gift for you just to say thank you for listening. No strings attached. We just want to give you some education to support what you're doing in the world. And thank you for being part of Cruise Elite and having us here on the podcast. So you got to reach out to us for that one. Send us a note on IG or the website or by email. But we want to just give education to people that are interested and support your learning and your training and spread neurology to more people around the world.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Professor, you did not let us down. This is going to be an hour and a half that is absolutely packed with information, and I'm going to listen to this several times myself, because during this whole conversation, see, when you start to educate, I start to sit back away from my microphone and relax like the old days when we were in class together. And I started to do that and had to come back to my notes and had to jump ahead a couple thoughts and be like, wait, stay on track with what you wanted to do here. But we did that. And this was an awesome episode. I knew it would be. And I just want to thank you for being here. And maybe we'll just do this again. We'll keep doing it. It's awesome to have you on the show, and you're a wealth of information. And man, this is going to be a good one.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me again. I love this topic. Love talking with you, getting to see you and spend time with your listeners. So yeah, I'm down. Let's do it again, man. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. All right, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. If you want to connect with Matt and see what he's up to over at Next Level Neuro, make sure to check out the link in our show notes. Hey, I want to take a minute just to thank everybody for your support on the podcast thus far. It really means a lot to us, and I want to encourage you to give the show a 5-star review, well, because it really helps. That's it for today. Thank you all so much for listening. Peace out.